You may have seen recently an FBI assessment that was unclassified that said that the Maduro regime is using and planning to use trained Nicaragua terrorists to carry out assassination plots on American soil. Now, very few in this room covered that. I'll let you all ask yourselves why you didn't cover it and why your editors didn't assign that story to you. Something I think you should think about on your own. But this is a earth-shattering piece of news. The Biden administration imported the terrorist army that our own FBI assesses is planning assassination strikes on American soil against critics of the Maduro regime. Those are the terrorists that President Trump is finding and apprehending that our Democrat judges and Democrat activists are trying to keep on U.S. soil. Trained Nicaragua has the same legal status as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. MS-13 has the same legal status as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These are foreign terrorists operating on our soil. And our gratitude to El Salvador for agreeing to take custody of these terrorists is immense.
Good to be back with you. I'm Katie Tur. That has been the Trump administration's big argument for invoking the Alien Enemies Act and deporting more than 100 Venezuelans to a maximum security prison in El Salvador without due process, claiming that they're all part of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Nicaragua, whose members count as alien enemies, they argue, subject to deportation. And they're being controlled by Nicolas Maduro's regime to destabilize the U.S. Shortly after the act was invoked, officials at the National Intelligence Council wrote an assessment directly and explicitly undercutting that argument, though, saying in part the Maduro regime probably does not have a policy of cooperating with TDA and is not directing TDA movement to and operations in the United States. The Intelligence Council has not observed the regime directing TDA, including to push migrants to the United States. The FBI, as you heard from Stephen Miller there, was the only intelligence unit to partially disagree with that study's conclusion. Now, though, weeks later, the top two officials at the National Intelligence Council, which issued that report, have been fired by DNI Tulsi Gabbard without explanation. Joining us now, NBC News senior correspondent covering national security and the military, Courtney Kuby, and New York Times Washington investigative correspondent Mark Mazzetti. So, Courtney, what is the reason being given for their firing?
So we heard from the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Jim Himes, and he said, look, it appears that the reason being given is vague accusations in the media, and those include things that you just laid out, Katie. The fact that these intelligence officials from the National Intelligence Council, they were part of this assessment that contradicted President Trump's reasoning for invoking the Alien Enemies Act against this Venezuelan gang, which specifically was that they were backed by the Venezuelan government. And as you mentioned, once that assessment came out and clearly contradicted President Trump, well, a short time later, these two officials, including Michael Collins, who was the acting chair of the National Intelligence Council, and his deputy, were both fired. And Katie, one of the reasons that this is getting some pushback, including by people like Congressman Himes, is because this is seen as a nonpartisan body in the intelligence community. One thing that our viewers may be familiar with is the global threat assessment. There's always hearings on the Hill, on the House and the Senate, where they go through this assessment. It goes through the biggest threats that the United States and the world faces every single year. Well, the National Intelligence Council is one of the main bodies that provides information to that. And this also goes after a number of other instances where officials have said that Tulsi Gabbard appears to be going after people who in any way voice any kind of views that are contrary to President Trump's policy in the intelligence community. So at this point, we don't have a lot of specificity beyond these accusations that they are putting out in the media, Katie.
And beyond what it just looks like. We're going to have Jim Himes joining us in a moment. Mark, I want to ask you about whether this is all Tulsi Gabbard or whether there's some outside influence here. Laura Loomer has been pretty vocal about these folks. She helped get National Security Council members fired from the White House. Could she have been playing a part in the dismissal of these two people?
Well, it's obviously not the first time that an intelligence assessment that is at odds with the president's policy either leaks or is declassified and embarrasses the White House. That's happened over the decades. What is obviously different is for the people who wrote the assessment to then be summarily fired. And so my guess is that it is beyond just Tulsi Gabbard, and that there's other forces involved in getting rid of the people at the National Intelligence Council. I think that there's also a broader issue going on here as well with this taking the presidential daily brief away from the CIA, putting it in the DNI. There's been a turf battle between the CIA and the DNI since the creation of the DNI 20 years ago, and usually the CIA wins the turf battles. In this case, it's interesting because it does look like Gabbard is trying to sort of exert some, or more than some, control over the CIA, the rest of the intel community, so things flow through her and her office, and this becomes kind of more of an arm of the White House as opposed to an independent intelligence community.
Let me get a little bit more on that, because part of this is the presidential's daily brief, which had always been prepared by the CIA, handed over to the DNI, and the DNI would present it to the president. Gabbard, who the reporting shows or suggests was told by Donald Trump at one point that maybe her position shouldn't exist, maybe the office of DNI doesn't need to exist any longer. She's taken control of the presidential daily brief. What does that mean for national security to have her office make up that brief, make up that report, instead of the CIA doing it?
Well, I think it means a few things. First and foremost, that her office and she becomes potentially a little bit more of a filter of the intelligence that gets to the president. The CIA for decades has considered the daily brief the sort of gold standard of what gets to the president, and their access to the president every morning is sort of the coin of the realm for them, because they get this daily FaceTime with the president. It gives them access, it gives them influence. If they don't get that, then there's going to be another filter going of that intelligence getting to the president, and that, we'll see what that would mean. But we all know that Tulsi Gabbard's views on certain issues are at odds with a lot of people at the agency and at other intelligence agencies. So that could color the overall assessments that get to the president and could color decision making.
All right, Courtney and Mark, thank you guys very much. Joining us now, as promised, the ranking member on House Intelligence, Congressman Jim Himes. I want to start where Mark just left off, which is that Tulsi Gabbard, the DNI, and you know this from confirmation hearings or from just having to have oversight over her and having conversations about her assessment of intelligence over the years. He's saying that she sees things differently than most intelligence offices, the community. If she's in control of the presidential daily brief, do you have concerns? And if you do, what are those concerns?
Yeah, well, those concerns are kind of encapsulated in this whole story, right? And let me back up away from all of the kind of oily-looking stuff associated with the firing of two professionals who produced a report which was at odds with what the president, what Tulsi Gabbard were saying. You just put up a tweet, I think it was a tweet, that had this statement that this is yet another example of people inside the intelligence community who are not consistent, I can't remember the wording, with the policies of the president. That makes absolutely no sense. And it's really important that people understand that the intelligence community is not a policy body. It's not like the State Department, which may say, hey, you ought to negotiate a deal with Russia or not. The intelligence community is not a policy body. They have one job and one job only, and that is to provide the very best intelligence conclusions and analysis to policy makers, to the president and to others, right? So the idea that somebody inside this organization whose sole purpose is to provide information is at odds with the policy of the president just makes absolutely no sense. Yeah. And what worries me here, to answer your question very specifically, first of all, it's not clear to me how much the president actually either looks at or is moved by the president's daily brief. But if the DNI is intercepting the conclusions of this $90 billion operation we have to try to provide the best information to the president and putting a slant on it the way she did with the Venezuela, Tren de Aragua thing, this country becomes a lot less safe than it should be.
Is this going to affect the intelligence that you get as a member of the Gang of Eight?
Well, it could, right? I mean, this is the other big worry. The other big worry is two individuals, lifelong intelligence professionals were fired. Now, I've asked the DNI for the reason for that. And I would note that ordinarily when people of that seniority are fired, my committee should be informed. We learned about this on Fox News. Okay, no reason has been given other than this vague accusation of, weaponizing or politicizing. Imagine what every other senior person in the intelligence community is thinking if it doesn't turn out that these two individuals were fired for a good reason. The message comes through loud and clear, which is that if you produce information that is at odds with the things that the president says or believes, you will lose your job. And these are enormously good people, but they're people, right? And so at worst, this looks like it could be an attempt to really shape the information that gets to the president. And that's a very, very dangerous world.
I'm going to go broad. I wonder if you think we're safe right now. And I ask that because we've seen some really galling or worrisome security breaches or lapses with this administration. You have Hegseth, the defense secretary, sharing war or attack plans over signal. I mean, that we know of. There could be other things that we don't know of. You have the president of the United States who seems pretty happy and content to accept a plane from a foreign nation. No strings attached, he says. I think that's questionable. You have this director of national intelligence taking over the presidential daily brief as you're talking about allegations that two people who didn't align with the president's policies were fired. And now this looming threat that if you don't get in line on the political agenda with this administration and tailor your information to that agenda, then you're going to be fired. Are we in a situation where we're at risk of missing something serious that might put, individual lives in danger here in the country?
I mean, the answer to that question is yes, right? I mean, let me put you into two pairs of shoes. Imagine the analyst right now at CIA. Maybe that analyst is an African-American woman, right? And she sees the war on DEI, and she says, now in the hallways, do people look at me and say, I'm a DEI hire, I'm an affirmative action hire? She may have the confidence to say, no, I'm not, but she's thinking about that rather than thinking about the terrorist groups that it is her job to cover, or the missiles in North Korea that she's supposed to watch. General Tim Hawk, superb commander of Cyber Command and director of the NSA, apparently fired because Laura Loomer, and again, we don't have good reasons yet for that firing, which was weeks ago, apparently fired because Laura Loomer didn't like it. Again, imagine what these people who have dedicated their lives to keeping us safe are thinking if their job is at risk because Laura Loomer walks into the Oval Office and says, I don't like that guy. So there's that category of people. Then imagine that you're a terrorist. Imagine that you're a terrorist and you say to yourself, wow, Pete Hegseth, who put operational plans for an attack on Yemen onto an unsecure signal chat, is at the Pentagon. You've got these ongoing scandals at the DNI about firing people who provide information. Do I think this is a worse time or a better time to try to conduct an attack on the United States? My guess is when they look at this chaos and they look at this politicization, the answer is this is a better time than we have seen for a while to undertake an attack.
Is this concern shared by your colleagues, your Republican colleagues?
So, I mean, sadly, my Republican colleagues here remain a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald J. Trump, right? So they're not interested in the tough questions at all because it puts their head above the parapet. And again, remember what happens to people who espouse views separate from the president's. They get fired. In this case, they would get primaried. And so, no, half the Congress, the majority, the narrow majority in both the House and the Senate, have no interest in really getting involved in any of this stuff, including crazy things like a 747 being donated for the president to fly around in moments of crisis. I think this will change, but right now, the Republicans in the House and the Senate are wholly owned subsidiaries of Donald J. Trump.